Hello, I'm Mark Tucker,
And I'm Alan Furstenberg. We are Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. How you doing today, Alan?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
Oh, doing just fine.
Good to hear.
Many adventures of coding and different operating systems.
always an adventure trying to deal with other people who aren't quite on the same platform as you.
Yeah, no, I've just been doing Windows development, I guess development on Windows and I guess Windows development too for decades and then just never made the move over to a Mac. And I know a lot of people develop on Macs and they swear by them and love them. And it really hasn't been an issue until every once in a while I get on a project where all the scripts and everything are set up for those that are developing on a Mac. And then I have to try to figure out, what am I going to do? Do I rewrite all the scripts so that there's Windows equivalents? So I find this time around, for the first time, I've tried Windows subsystem for Linux and got pretty far. But then there were always these annoying issues when it came time to check in code or debug in Visual Studio Code or other things. So I finally, in frustration, posted something today. And thanks to John Kelvey, I am trying Visual Studio Code Remote and a few other things. And I don't know, that might be my solution.
Yeah.
Seems to be working okay so far.
It's always a good start. Always good to learn something new and see if that helps in the broader approach to things, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I very much appreciate people that are willing to answer my weird questions or my throw up my hands and like, ah.
Well, I think one of the important things about that to remember is that your weird question has almost certainly been asked by someone else before. So either there is an answer out there or there is somebody else who wants that answer to be out there. Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of what we do. That's as developers, that's kind of our life too, in a lot of ways, is just either finding the answers or helping someone else find the answers. And that's an important role for a senior developer, even for a junior developer.
Yep. Well, and it's every day is there something new. Even if you're doing the same technologies, you've got a different application, different problems, different requirements. Or it's, hi, I'm learning something brand new today, different framework, different library, different, different way of doing things. And that's one of the things that you're always learning with development.
I feel like it's always one more question. And it's always that question. It's the question that even when you think you know something really well, you get that one more question or you have that one more question. You're like, yeah, I don't know this platform as well as I thought I did, or this system or this compiler or this whatever it is we're using. It's always that one more question. And I think that's great. That's one of the things I like about this industry in some ways.
Yeah, I also sometimes I just like to say, hey, show me how you do this.
Yeah.
And watching how somebody else approaches it, and you're like, oh, I think your way is better.
Or or even if it's not better, it gives me a new way to think about what I'm doing to help me understand the bigger picture better. And that helps me do what I do the way I do it better.
No, definitely. Just there's so much to learn.
And
a lot of times we learn from the questions that we get asked, right?
Exactly, which I guess kind of brings us to this week, which is based on a question that we got from our friend Rebecca Evanhoe, who kind of tossed out some questions to us about device capabilities and how we as developers can know what kind of device it's running on. And Rebecca asked this as a designer. And I think this, one of the things this highlights to me is saying designers, have a certain perspective on things and then kind of need to check in with the developers and make sure that it can actually be done.
Right.
And in this case, it was one of those, can you find out what a device can do? Or do you just have to make a bunch of assumptions sometimes? Yeah,
there's definitely a lot to explore on that. So on the Alexa side, capabilities are a lot of times, I guess you'll see them in the developer console as interfaces and in the JSON that's coming into your request as supported interfaces. So as part of each request that you get a list of some information about which interfaces are supported. And it's it's two parts, because during development time, you need to go in the console and say, I am going to support the audio player, check. I'm going to support the video player. I'm going to support regular display templates, or now the new style APL templates. So there's a number of different settings. Let's see, I think I named most of them. Yeah. So audio, video, display, and APL. Oh, and web API for games. So if you're going to use one of or more of those things in your skill, you need to let Alexa know ahead of time via the console and inside the developer console, the interfaces tab, so that it knows what types of things to look out for. And when you do that during runtime, when the request comes in, you can check a specific location in your request and see what the supported interfaces are. And it will say, yes, I support audio player. This device supports audio player, or this device is a screen device, and so it supports APL. So that's kind of a two-part. And that type of information that you get is just very high level, like, yes, I support it. And maybe like with APL, I support version, the highest version that this device supports currently is this version. So then you might be able to do some checks and say, okay, I'm not going to show this new feature that I know is not, or use this new feature that's not quite out yet for all the devices.
It's similar on the Google side with, I think, an interesting variant. So looking at what you get on the runtime first, it gives you an array of what it refers to as capabilities. And they can be speech, long form audio, interactive, web link, can it launch a web browser or go to a link, and rich response. And it seems kind of in some ways funny that one of the capabilities is speech. And that seems a little odd, but it seems like they were thinking about the fact that there might be some assistants that only run on something that doesn't have a speaker.
Yeah.
Like a watch. And or inside a Google Meet chat, or, it's part of what used to be Allo. So in that way, it kind of makes sense. We'll get to some of the oddities of that later, I think. But also you can list what it in the Actions console, what it refers to as a required capability. So for required capabilities, you then say that you need to have access to the interactive canvas, or you need a web link, or you need something with a screen, and that will support rich response. There's a screen as part of the Action console, which has a bunch of toggles and say, here's what I need. And it will tell you what devices it can run on. So
that's nice.
As you toggle things on and off, it will say, well, this runs on phones and smart displays, or this will run on speakers and phones and smart displays, or this won't run on Android Auto now. So it's kind of clever in that way, but it's also not completely obvious in all cases.
But that goes all the way into the Actions directory, right? So you could see, yes, for any particular app, oh, this is the device I have, and is it supported, yes or no?
Well, so here's the thing. It will show you what devices are supported, but when it comes to something like the assistant link, that's not exactly considered. So assistant links are yet another oddity in this case. The other interesting notion with this is that interactive canvas itself is not one of those toggles right now.
Yeah.
In order to get interactive canvas, you have to go to a separate spot on the console and say, yes, this is a game. And now,
and then once you say it's a game, then you have that. Now all of a sudden you have this super secret toggle,
right? That opens up. Yeah, it's a little convoluted still, and you actually, in that case, you need to check both of those checkboxes. So you need to say both this is a game and this uses the interactive canvas. But once you get that, you get the capability showing up.
And so then you can, as part of the request coming in, you can say, oh, this does support this, or or I guess it would actually checks against the device you're currently running on and saying that this device does support this capability, right?
Yeah. So when the request comes in, it'll first make sure that it can run on the device. And if it can't, it says, I'm sorry, this action won't run on this device. So it doesn't even get sent to you.
Oh, so that's interesting. It does a pre-check even before it invokes the action.
I would say it's as part of the invocation. I'm not entirely sure what stage it is that it does that check.
But you didn't have to write any additional code.
There's nothing that I have to write. It never hits my backend. It never hits my webhook.
Okay.
If I have indicated long form media is required, and it gets called without the long form media capability available.
Because that's interesting, because the toggles, even though on Alexa you need to check which devices or which interfaces you want to support, there is no check that you support it. So then you also have to check before you send like APL back or something, does this device support APL?
Even if you've said that it requires APL?
Yes. So like, like my picture guesser game that I've deployed all the way back in 2018, back then it was just display templates. I had to mark that it supported display templates, but then I had to check in my code at the very beginning during the launch intent to say, if this device does not support display templates, then give them a message saying that that this is only supported with screen devices, and then gracefully exit.
Interesting. It's actually, it's very interesting in some cases. I've had code that is expecting something like a long media device, or a long form media, and it will send that back, and the action has considered to have crashed because I've sent back something that I've said that the device type doesn't support.
Oh, interesting.
And I didn't do the check for it. I just, assumed that everything will support whatever it was at the time.
No, long form media, that's audio player and video player?
It's what's known as the media player, which right now is just an audio player.
Oh, just an audio. Okay.
Yeah. It's long form audio as opposed to audio you can embed at SSML.
Yes.
Long form video, we can discuss ways to deal with that, but it basically involves the interactive canvas.
Yes, and I was going to say it does. Finally, it has interactive canvas. Does support that. Other things on the Alexa side, interestingly, because I told you the whole list of things that were things that you need to pre-check before, and there's a toggle. There's a couple of other things that you get in supported interfaces as part of the request coming in that has to do with if you're running a device that has a GPS. So there are some additionally flags. Yeah. So like, for example, I'll name a couple of devices. I have a, I'm trying to remember who makes this. Anchor makes an embedded Alexa device that you plug into your audio, your whatever your audio jack, and then your lighter, I guess your power port, they call them nowadays.
Right.
Yeah. It used to be the old cigarette lighters
yes.
long ago. And so you can get information like, does this support geolocation? Does it support navigation? And then you can work with that. Also, there's a certain flag that says is automotive. Now the special is automotive flag I only get on Echo Auto, not some of these other in-car Echo third-party devices I've got. So interestingly, but you can do some additional things. You can change some behavior, make your prompts shorter, give us some sort of a message saying, hey, you're in the car. Let's, maybe it's not best to play this or, do this at this time. Or so you can do a number of different things. But that reminds me of another thing called, or I guess the way that you can communicate with actions and the way actions can communicate with devices. And those are events and directives.
Well, before we get to events and directives, though,
yes.
I guess I want to kind of look at the parallel on the Google side.
Go ahead.
And there is none. So, I mean, there is no flag to indicate whether Android Auto is running. There's no flag to indicate if you're on Anchor's automotive product. And if you want location, you need to go through the hoops of asking for location if you're in Dialogflow. and you can't get it if you're an action builder. So you're really out of luck.
Room for improvement for in automobile devices for Google. Is that what you're saying?
Sure, we'll look at it that way. I think certainly on the automotive side right now, they're mostly thinking about it as an app action. So you have an Android Auto app action that has voice-enabled capabilities to it, and that's a completely different approach than how we tend to think about actions and skills right now.
So you can drive an existing mobile app with your voice. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's what app actions are aiming to do. Yeah.
Yeah. But not having, not voice activating, or specifically voice activating actions.
No, not in the same way. Not in the same way that we think of them now. They're meant to be more embedded apps.
Okay.
More a conventional notion of how we think of apps.
So, do you want to talk about anything else about
No, let's hear about
events and directives.
Events and directives. Thank you. Yes.
All right. So when you go in and you do your normal voice input, then it resolves into an intent with slots, and that calls a handler that's inside of your code. As far as events go, they can be kind of handled similarly, but it's not something that the user initiates with voice. So it could be touching something on the screen. It could be like your skill is enabled, your skill's disabled. There's a number of different events that happen that you can get notifications of and do things inside your skill. And a lot of times, actually, it's like an out of band, out of session. Your skill still runs and acts as a back end and processes things, but it's not in part of any type of user, turn by turn session that they're using the skill. So that's getting information into a skill. To get information from a skill back to the device, you use directives. And so and I think they've been pretty consistent with this over time for quite a long time. Just think of a directive as additional JSON that you tack on to that response JSON that comes back. And it's got a specific name, and then you've got a number of different parameters that you can send information back.
Now these directives are part of a normal conversation, or they're also part of an out-of-band conversation? No,
these are part of a normal conversation.
Okay.
So when you invoke something with an action and you want to do something like simple case is that you want to show a screen along with your response, then you're going to send a directive that's part of that includes APL in it, and it's going to include the JSON that for the JSON for the APL, which is then going to get sent back as part of the response, and then the device is actually going to get that, and the device is going to do something with the information inside that directive and says, oh, I got APL, so I'm going to show that on the screen using this information and do whatever I need to do with that.
Okay, and this is also, I assume, the same method that's used to set timers, for example, on the local device. Is that done with directives?
Oh, you know what? I'd have to look.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Probably.
I didn't mean to catch off guard on that.
No, that's right. I'd have to look. I've done reminders, and sometimes things just get hidden behind something with Jovo. So then I'd have to actually go back and behind the scenes and look and oh yeah, that is a directive. That makes sense. I would say probably it is. That would be the same thing that makes sense. You get your part of your response, which is your text to speech, which then gets converted into audio by the Alexa service on the way back, and that's played on the device. And there's some stuff that's just to pass through. Interestingly, some of the new APL for audio stuff goes and is processed on the middle tier, and then that's passed back as audio onto the device, as opposed to having any type of processing on the device for that. So it's usually relatively simple things, I would think, that you can include with that. And there's different types of devices, like there's screen devices, or there's that Echo Dot with clock that has a special form of APL called APL-T for text.
Missing the one that's missing some letters, right?
That is the one that is missing some letters. as part of the response. But like for some of the navigation things, if you can do navigation, you can say, like you can do a directive that would say, this is my destination, and you could pass information about your destination, and then the device would be able to
Do the navigation for you. Okay.
to handle that. Or if you do some sort of a voice command to say stop navigation, then it would be a directive that you can send back down to the device that actually turns that off. So it's basically a way of passing information and kind of triggering that something's going to happen on the device, and the device is who actually worries about it and processes it. So that's kind of how directives work.
So I'm afraid I'm going to ask you something again that you might not have played with enough. So are directives what also sends the data back if you're using Web API for games? So
there is a directive. So I'm pretty sure that's what it is, because there is a special alexa.presentation.html type that gets supported. So I'm pretty sure that's what ends up happening. So similar to passing information from a Google action that then ends up calling the on update JavaScript inside your whatever, because part of the response is the URL that it's going to. I'm pretty sure that's how Web API for games works as well.
That it's handled, and that's handled using a directive. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the case. I'll check afterwards, and if it's not, then
we'll put it in the show notes.
I'll let you know. So that's the information of passing things back. Interestingly enough, and I don't know, maybe do you get any additional information on the Google side of things, like how big of a screen you're on?
No.
Nope. No additional information along those lines.
Nope, none of that comes across at all. In fact, no. The only way to handle that is if you're using the interactive canvas, you obviously have access to that information because you're running JavaScript on the screen. And then you can send that back as if you wish, but it's totally up to you to handle that if you want. In general, the server treats it as device agnostic or specific device agnostic.
Yeah, so since there's a number of things that you could make, I guess, decisions about on inside the Alexa skill side of things, because in some ways it's acting like it's a server, and the old style, web pages where all the processing that was done on the server, and then you returned the HTML back that was just rendered on the client. Right. APL is kind of like that. So there's a number of things that you can do, or that they expect you to be able to do to check to see, some different arguments, and then you could, process things differently. So that's
so on the server. So as part of and once upon a time, as part of HTTP, you did get things like, what is the screen size? What is the operating system? And over time, we learned to stop trusting that because everyone was lying. But it sounds like so it's things like screen size. Do you get device type or device model?
No. So you don't get anything specific like that, and So it's interesting because you get information. Here, I'll just read through some of the stuff that you get. So you get a viewports object back, an array that has different information, and so it tells you like if it's a rectangle versus if it's a circle, that good old echo spot that's not around anymore. Gives you the DPI. It gives you a mode that's a hub versus, I guess, something else. I'm thinking that like TV would be coming back as something else.
Okay.
It gives you some video codecs that are supported. It gives you, the pixel width and pixel height that you can do things with. And then it starts giving you some information, like especially with the new Echo Show 10 that's out, that rotates. So you get a flag if it, can you rotate it? And it gives you some information about how it responds to touch. Is it, can you do a single touch? is it, does it support the remote? Because certain things like a TV supports kind of the equivalent of touch, but you'd have to use that with using the remote control keypad to do that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
No, it's interesting. That all makes sense.
Yeah.
That I think what's most interesting about that is rather than try to map kind of generic concepts, it kind of says, okay, it's up to you to figure out what you want your APL to look like.
Yeah.
Given these parameters, and here's a pile of parameters. And I think it's interesting if you contrast that, for example, with Bixby, who essentially is saying, we're not going to give you anything, but it's up to you to write all of these different templates to handle how you want things to look on these different devices. And here are the various templates that are available to you.
Right. Now, with APL, you do have some, APL is once again a JSON format that is doing the equivalent of what HTML would do and some of what CSS would do for the device. And you do have some capabilities to do some, like some conditions and say,
Okay.
kind of like what you would think would be responsive breakpoints in the web. You could test for different hub sizes or different things to help indicate like, oh, this template is going to be used on this case, or this template is going to be used in this case. And there is some capability to make them responsive too by using units that are not specifically pixels, but are like percentages of the screen type of thing. So it's kind of interesting because you've got some control over what's happening on the server, and you've got some control on the device. Interestingly, at least unless they've changed it recently, if you wanted to send the smallest possible background image down for the device that's supported, you would have to check that on the server and send a different URL. Otherwise, you could send like the really big one, and then it would have to, shrink it or crop it.
I was going to say downscale or
downscale, yeah. So you do have some capabilities. In some ways, I wish it was easier to just be able to say, here's a directory with all my images in it and pick the run that's the right one. But that's how that part works.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned before that there were some gotchas with the device capabilities, and in particular, thinking about the one that says there's a speaker. One of the
Yes.
interesting gotchas is I haven't found a device yet that doesn't report speaker. So they all seem to. This includes the assistant running on an Android device, even when you're typing into it and when you invoked it by keyboard.
Okay.
And that's a kind of, this was something you and I had discussed when you were testing something with Snatchword. You discovered that you weren't getting any audio.
Yes.
And the reason we figured out was because it was being launched by keyboard and the person was typing stuff in. So they were never hearing anything. And that's because the assistant on Android says, if you don't invoke it by voice, you may be in a scenario where you can't or shouldn't speak.
Yep.
And since you can't speak, we're not going to speak either.
That's
and that makes some sense.
Yeah.
There's logic to this. The problem is it doesn't tell you this in the capabilities.
Yes.
So the capabilities continue to report that you have a speaker, even if you don't.
Well, and there's nothing that you do, right? You just keep passing back the audio back as part of your SSML, and they're like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, you know what? I hadn't looked at this. Maybe that's where, and I haven't really used this on SSML for an audio link to specify text to say if the audio isn't there.
I mean, that's certainly where you would use it, or that's certainly where they're expecting you to use it, and it makes sense. But there's no way to test for the capability about whether it's going to do it or not.
That's true.
Because, certainly you can see cases where even if you are sending stuff back, you might deliberately adapt to something completely different if you know they're not even going to hear some of what you're trying to say.
Yeah, and I was looking at this just recently. This reminds me of a feature that was released all the way back in 2018 for Alexa called Tap to Alexa. That means that it's a special setting. You go into accessibility and you say, turn on Tap to Alexa. What that means is that you can set up like what you would say, open such and such skill, or what's the weather, or things, to the point where it's just an icon that you tap on the screen and then it opens it up. And some of the first party stuff that's built in, I'm assuming, hopefully all of the first party stuff that's built in, like weather and timers and stuff, has a UI so that you have feedback to that. But if I'm somebody that, maybe it's a household where I have Alexa devices with screens around, but there is somebody that has, that's deaf or has a hearing loss, and they want to interact with the same types of things with just tap and keyboard, then you'd have to actually approach additional things, with your APL, where anytime there's an input, you'd have to be able to provide a way for them to type into a keyboard, and that's not something that's built in. So then you'd have to build a whole keyboard and APL with the ability to type and all that. So it seems like there's a use case that's not necessarily being handled, where people want to use these screen devices, but they don't or can't use hearing either way. And they just want to do it screen only, but still use the same things that other people in the household are using, or just want to use the technology.
Right. Certainly there are use cases we can picture where you don't want to hear anything.
Yep.
And sometimes that just means being a little more expansive in your design. And sometimes that means you may need to adapt very dramatically. There are certainly some games that I play that, for that matter, crosstalk relies on the fact that you're going to hear the question. Yeah. And that was a bad choice. That's a bad design, and that needs to be, I need to fix that.
Yeah, so that's I think we've gotten a little bit into accessibility, and there are some definitely advantages. If you're blind, then voice is a great opportunity, but I think there's you've got some ability to go either direction, or kind of support both of those use cases better.
No, and I think, and again, using the device capabilities and figuring out what the device capabilities lets us figure out what is the best way to adapt under different circumstances. And
so if the user
selects, it's not right there yet.
If the user has a setting where they say audio off, then we should be able to have that capability saying, oh, they're in an audio off situation, and then we can behave, appropriately.
Well, and it sounds like Google at least theoretically supports that. If speaker is off, if you don't get the speaker capability, then make sure you handle that. And what does that mean? How do you handle that?
I haven't seen any documents from either side that really go into to what to do in that situation.
I haven't either, because I think everyone's assuming that it's going to have a speaker.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's a topic we will have to revisit in the future after we talk to some people.
Yeah. Or if you know more than us about this situation, we'd love to hear from you, because this is kind of an interesting thing that I've just bumped into recently and thought, it makes sense that we need to figure out, what to do in these different scenarios.
Yeah, and it's an important one. I think we want to make sure that we design systems that everybody can use. It just means we need to be aware of what that means sometimes.
Yep. I have another question, and I think you alluded to it at some point, about devices, identifying unique devices.
Yes.
So on the Alexa side of things, every device in my household has a unique device ID. Now, I'm pretty sure it's like the user ID that I use inside of a separate skill, then the device ID is going to be different. So there's not really a way to keep track or track somebody's devices across skills, even across skills that are by the same publisher. But you can do some interesting things. Like if you have a skill that behaves differently based on what room you're in, you could say during setup, like, hey, what room are you in? And you're like, I'm in the kitchen, I'm in the living room. And you could then record, say, oh, that flag is associated with this particular device ID. So every time that I start it back up, I can say, hey, I can see you're back in the kitchen, and or whatever, right? So interestingly, I did try that too. That I ran my skill on a couple of different devices at the same time. So I'm assuming that I could be playing the same game or executing the same skill and get different IDs based on who it is. I guess what device it is.
Well, what device it is, right?
Yeah. And you could then kind of equate that to like, oh, this is this one's in my kids' room, this one's in the family room, and so you could then, I guess, set up a scenario where you could play against other people in your household because you have a different device ID. So you could.
Well, each one would also be a different session, so you can.
Yep.
You can track it like that, but you can also kind of, there are certainly things that you can do when you know what the device ID, when you're on a different device. Yes. So you're asking, can this be done on Google?
Yeah.
No.
So is there even like a concept of a device ID? And if there is it the same across all devices?
So the short answer is there is a concept of a device ID, and there is a concept of a device name. It's part of what they refer to as the home graph. And if you are building a smart home system, you have kind of a side door access to that, but it's only a side door access.
Okay.
You don't actually know what any given device is. You don't actually know where it is. You're given some idea about it. And in the conversational world, we don't have access to it at all.
Okay. So in a standard action, that's not a smart,
we have no
home
access whatsoever.
Uh,
I will also use this opportunity to remind you, we also don't have access to a session ID or a user ID.
I didn't know about the session ID, that you didn't have that.
No, we have
Interesting.
Nothing. I mean, we have ways to synthetically create a session ID and synthetically create a user ID.
Right.
And
then store that so that it always comes back.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have ways to do it, but we don't have one that Google gives us, and we certainly don't have a device ID.
Mm.
Now, we do have access to a home graph. We have access to home storage, which is only available to everything that's part of the same home graph.
Okay.
Which does not include mobile devices because they're not part of the home graph.
Oh, okay. Because you had said something like that they're all part of the same, but then I've tested like on my phone versus on my my hub, and so they're not the same, huh?
No.
They're not the same user.
No, and it's not entirely clear why, especially because there are first-party actions that clearly can do this. So for example, if I want to send a message to a specific other speaker, I could say broadcast a message to, and I could name the speaker and it would work. And I can do that from my mobile device because it knows where my home graph is.
Oh.
But I don't get access to the same thing on a third-party action level.
Okay.
So the short answer for all practical purposes is no.
Doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist.
All right.
Unfortunately, you can sort of see why there are some obvious privacy implications here that I think Google was trying to avoid, but it does get frustrating.
Yeah. But just like they punted that with the user ID that you have to generate.
Yeah.
And the way that Alexa handles it is that some user, they know who you are because you've got an Alexa account, so they know what your email is. They have access to payments. There's a number of they know all bunch of stuff about you, right? But when it comes to an Alexa skill, then when you invoke it or enable it, then it gets a unique ID that for that user. So what, so
For that user, for that skill.
yeah. And in some cases for that enablement. So like if I were to disable it and then re-enable it again, then I would get a separate ID. And then they've gone, I guess they've extended that to devices, that every device that's being used on this enabled skill gets a unique ID as well.
Yeah, and I think let's put it this way. I think that's reasonable assurances of privacy.
Yeah.
I guess somebody in Google's security department doesn't think so. And beyond that, I couldn't tell you why.
Yeah. So I think we've gone through quite a bit about capabilities. There's definitely more to read up on it. And there's some of these interfaces that I really haven't used yet. I haven't had a situation to use them. But would totally be interested in how people are using those capabilities, some tips and tricks about them. A shout out to the APL Ninja site. It's a site where it's kind of like CodePen or some of those other programming sites, but it's all about APL. So you can do snippets of APL or start building and learning or looking at code that somebody else has done for APL. And that will give you some indications on how to use some of this stuff. Yeah, that fits into this capabilities talk as well. If you have a device that takes APL.
And thanks to Rebecca for her question. Hopefully we answered it. But if not, let us know and we'll address it on another show.
Yeah.
And again, if you've got questions that you're curious about or you're trying to figure out or you want answered, let us know and we will try to answer it on a future show.
Yeah. And until then, happy coding.
Happy coding, everyone. We are Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Take care.
Take care. Have a good week, Mark.
Thanks. You too, Alan.